So actually I've been very interested in women's magazines in Hindi, and more recently there's been also very interesting work on women's magazines in Urdu, and the fact that, for me, the fact that there were more than 100 women's magazines in Urdu is a really, it's amazing, but also really interesting, an interesting fact to think about what kind of voice and what kind of public do these magazines create. Because I think particularly in the case of Urdu, but I think in Hindi as well, a lot of, although the magazines often, and I think particularly the magazine Chand, but also Sri Darpan and so on, they talked a lot about women studying maybe abroad or taking up professions. There was a lot of talk about women's activism abroad and in India. So, you had the sense of the magazine somehow connected with the coming out in the public. But actually, I think for a lot of women and for a lot of readers, the magazine was more about being part of a public without actually going out of the home. So this interesting idea of a public at home. So, you still feel you're part of a public. The world is coming to you through the magazine, but you're not. It's not necessarily. It's more about being changing the way you think of yourself as a person, perhaps. Also, I suppose, managing that sense with all your other responsibilities and the expectations that other people have of you. Because, in fact, also in this magazine, still you have, the Sina Pirona, you have the kitchen, you have, the sort of the bringing up of children and your duty towards your husband and in-laws, are kind of paramount. That never gets really questioned for most of the time. But I think there was this really, a lot of the magazines were about some kind of, change in society, whether you call it reform or not. The idea that that things were changing, that they had to change, that women had demands, whether it was for, hukuk, for rights, or for some kind of azadi, or for, which of course was a term that a lot of people didn't like in relation to women, not too much azadi. But I think that was very much part of the ethos of the magazine. What seems to me to happen after independence, but I think it's, not enough work has been done about it, is that whole aspect of we are part of a general transformation, we are part of some kind of movement. That seems to sort of subside a bit. My student Akriti Mandvani has done a very interesting work recently on what she calls middlebrow magazines, very popular magazines, not necessarily just about women, but with a lot of women readers, like Sarita in Hindi. And you have, quite strong women voices there, just both about the contributors and about the from the contributors and from readers. But it's other kinds of, she calls it the sort of the right to be a consumer, for example, the right, not to be all just about duties, but to have some kind of, personal fulfillment or personal life. And so, yes, I think that that's sort of the general kind of transformation of society, independence, those subside as ideals, but I suppose other voices and other tones and other demands still, are still there. You ask very difficult questions. Actually, to be honest, the idea of pleasure and entertainment there, they were not so much about. Pleasure, of course, has a, you could say shock or whatever, has a long history, and that other scholars, particularly scholars, like scholars of music, like Catherine Butler Schofield, have, or aesthetics have dealt more. My point in choosing that, the title for my book, Print and Pleasure, was because print had been studied a lot in relation to education, to the new genres, to reform, to the essay, the textbook, the novel. And actually what I was interested in was basically commercial publishing. What were the genres that in North Indian publishers in Hindi and Urdu published because they knew that people wanted to read. And so, I mean, you could say, there were also a lot of religious, religious genres and religious books, so that it's not all about entertainment. But certainly there was there were a combination of what I call, genres reproduced, so genres that were already popular, like the songs of the 12 months, the Baramasas, or songbooks, or qisse, kahaniyan, they were already circulating before print, and then genres that actually became popular through print, like detective novels. And the interesting point, I think, in that emerged from that research was that I talk about, the second half of the 19th century, which is the time in which Hindi and Urdu really part ways, and it's really a story about, the differences between Hindi and Urdu. Whereas in commercial publishing, you see that the publishers see that, okay, this genre is having traction in Urdu, let's publish it in Nagari as well. Lithography makes it so easy to publish in both scripts. And actually more or less the same genres are popular, commercially, reprinted. Popular we see because they are printed, 2, 3, 5, 10, 20, 30 times in both languages. And so actually we can, the story of the parting of ways of Hindi and Urdu is not wrong, but it's not the only story. There's also a story that shows that taste, in songs, in qisse, became, were perhaps even more shared between, Hindi and Urdu readers. Actually, I've thought about a multilingual approach mostly for literary history, so particularly because not just in South Asia, but actually in other parts of the world that also have been very multilingual, literary histories typically have focused on just a single language, as if the other languages do not exist, or languages are just imagined to be in an adversarial or hostile relationship to another. So either because it's a colonial language and one is the local language, but then there are other languages that feel perhaps excluded or subordinate, and so for me it's been useful to have a multilingual approach. First of all, starting from what Andrew Olet today called the worldly multilingualism, the multilingualism that exists in spaces, that exist in our bodies just out for the as a result of our education or our personal experience, or simply what we are exposed to, whether we understand or not. So what we kind of become familiar with, whether we or have some familiarity with it if we don't know it very well. But yes, I think it's it can also be, I think, particularly as because our study tends to be so monolingual, it's actually also a writer or a text or a theme actually breathes in, whether they are actually present in the text or not. So for me, it's always useful to think about, okay, some texts are actually multilingual, but what about the multilingualism that is there outside the text? And actually you asked about comparative literature, so the last project that I was involved in was in fact a comparative project between North India, the Maghreb and the Horn of Africa, regions that all have been multilingual for a very long time, but all regions in which multilingualism has felt to be a problem, and actually what transpired was that reading together, which is an expression that my colleague Karim Al-Ashir used to, read together, for example, in her case, texts written in French and in Arabic that are usually studied separately. But what happens when you, and by Maghrebi authors, what happens when you read them together? In my case, one little example I took was, what happens when you read together Urdu, Hindi, and English texts that talk about the same theme, like, the village, or is there something that is related to a matrix of, not so much about, language, but maybe debates or perspectives, or, in that particular language. Now that's a difficult question. I think it would be easier for me to think about in a concrete term. I don't know if you have a concrete example in mind. So, you could say, people have worked at the level of genre, for example, like the ghazal as a world genre, and then you can see how different actually iterations of the ghazal in different languages and context create, different, very different texts, or maybe also have a different idea of the ghazal. And I think you can, for example, for genres that have maybe part of the kind of Islamicate, repertoire, you can actually do it quite easily across regions as well. So I don't know if that's one part of your question. Otherwise, in terms of course, then people talk about, if you work on translations and, the new meanings and the new text that translation creates. So you can look at a text not just in its kind of original language, but in its in the further iterations in the different languages, and then your approach would be multilingual in that respect. I think, again, Andrew Olet says, the multilingual, why do you call it multilingual? It's a pre-modern, or in fact you could say even the modern, in the sense that it's so ingrained, and scholars, I think, scholars of Sanskrit, or, maybe if you're a scholar of Pali, of course you would also know Sanskrit, and there are certain, if you're a scholar of Urdu, you probably know Persian, and if you're a scholar of Rajbhasha, of course you know Hindi. So certain kinds of bilingual or multilingual relations have been acknowledged. But I think what has been really interesting, if I think of the scholarship on the early modern, Mughal period, for example, or even the Sultanate, has been the relationship between languages that you wouldn't necessarily put together, like the Persian and Rajbhasha multilingualism. So I think the idea that, and you can cut it in several different ways, and so I suppose, the growth in scholarship in Persian and Bhashas, or vernaculars, or whatever you want to call it, so that Persian is not just a story of its own, or it's not just a story that relates just to Urdu, but see the presence of Persian, say, in Maharashtra, or in relation to Marathi, or perhaps in relation to Bangla, or in relation to Hindi. That I think has been a really interesting development, and there's been a lot of work recently on the early modern period, particularly. I think, and particularly I think scholars working, let's say, on music and songs, or on performance, I think they also have been very aware of the fact that performers, naturally have to know and perform and be able to cater to different audiences, and will have repertoires that include more than one language. As for future, and for me it's been important to take a spatial approach, to particularly because, again, partly in the sense of recognizing who else is there, who are your neighbors, who is what kind of relations do you are take place within neighbors. And I use this notion of the multilingual local in a way to make us think about that. So not just take it as a given that the local will be multilingual, but also think about what are the relations between people who either speak or write in different languages, because I go a lot to Allahabad, for example, and where there were writers in English, writers in Hindi, writers in Urdu, and scholars in Urdu, and they don't necessarily talk to each other. They may be aware of each other, but it's not as if just because they work in the same or live in the same city they will interact. So I find space actually a very useful lens, but I think another possibility is to follow a text or follow a genre as it travels across languages, for example, and see the different inflections that it picks up. It could be about the different tastes or the different languages that a single author, for example, cultivates. We heard today, I talk about, Ghalib as a Persian and as an Urdu poet. He seems to be doing different things in Persian and in Urdu. That's an interesting question to follow, rather than say, oh well, I just think of Ghalib as an Urdu poet, if Persian was so important for him. Well, I think actually, so my own experience, since I only studied Hindi, has been, and the other languages I learned later, has been that actually a lot of you have a lot to gain by, for example, making reading groups. So that apart from what you do in the classroom, and of course here in the United States you've got several years of language and classroom work that prepare you for this kind of research much more than in Europe or in the UK particularly, where I'm based. But still, there are ways in which finding your interlocutors, finding people who will help you. The reading group is a wonderful opportunity, not just to get help and inspiration and support, so that if that week you don't want to read, well, you have to because you have the reading group, but also because reading together is a way also of then having a conversation and a discussion about the text that you are reading, and that grows over time, so that then it becomes a basis for future thinking together. And I think that a lot of the interesting projects actually come from not just thinking on your own, but thinking beyond the possibilities of what you know, and adding your range of skills to the range of skills of others. In terms of archives, well, I think compared to the time that I worked, now of course digitized archives and resources have hugely increased, although of course we don't always know where they are and what they are, and so again you always have to ask and keep asking and ask as many people as you can, and that comes of course with one is a great bonus that we have all these texts that are you can just download, and or if you can't download you can read online, but on the other hand it's sometimes the material becomes too large, it's too big an archive, and so I think every time you have to probably do a large skimming and a large just immersing yourself in the archive, understand how the archive works, try to read along the grain, as scholars would put it, and then be more selective, and then actually try to not be overwhelmed by the amount of material, and perhaps also so I'm always interested in things that don't necessarily go together, that maybe contrast a little bit with each other, so or things that you would not expect, or things that seem like contradictions, because I think that contradictions or contrast help you create more complex and more interesting explanations or narratives about either an author or a text or a period, because then it's not just about one thing, but it's about the coexistence of differences.